worth having those verses in front of you. We're in a teaching series at the moment through various bits and pieces in the Gospel of John, and it's really called Encountering Jesus. And it's various people from different walks of life who come and know Jesus and encounter him, and they all do it in very different ways. And so I think that's great, and that's why we're taking time as a church to work through these different encounters, because if you stick with us long enough, you will find one of these just matches your situation very clearly indeed. And if you've missed the first few of these talks, you can go online and listen on our website or wherever you get your podcast from, and you should be able to catch up. Anyway, what we've just read this morning is a story or a narrative that I think probably we could say represents two prominent groups in Belfast. Or maybe in whatever town you're from. Two prominent groups. They are this. On the one hand, we've got the ordinary person who seems to be sort of vaguely spiritual in some ways, maybe a bit superstitious. And perhaps on the other hand, then we've got those who are what you would describe as religiously or maybe even politically fundamentalists. They're sort of fanatics, hard-headed, come across as perhaps a bit judgmental, a bit dismissive. There are other types of people, obviously, but for the purposes of today's talk, there are two sort of major groups of people in our city, and yet both desperately need to have an encounter with Jesus in order to make any sense of life, in order for them to be transformed and to enjoy life and peace and joy, and for our city also, likewise, to be transformed and enjoy life and peace and joy. And that happens when we encounter Jesus. So we'll see, I suppose we'll be studying those two groups in today's talk. And the first thing we'll see, number one, is that Jesus transforms the needy. Jesus transforms the needy. The second thing we'll see is that Jesus unsettles the self-righteous or the religious. Jesus transforms the needy, first of all. And we have this scenario here in John chapter 8 with this man. We don't know his name. But we are told twice, in verse 3 and verse 5, that he is an invalid. That's the word that's used to describe him. And it says there, an invalid, in verse 3, a multitude of invalids, people who are blind or lame or paralyzed. So most likely some sort of physical disability that he has. We don't know what that is, but we do know that he's had it, it says, for 38 years. In verse 5, one man who was there had been an invalid for 38 years. So whether he has been like this from birth, or whether something happened to him as a younger man, a disease perhaps, or maybe he had some sort of accident or trauma, we don't know. But we find him there in this encounter with Jesus, with a whole bunch of other people in a similar situation, the blind, the lame, the paralyzed. And as such, in those days, if you were blind or paralyzed in some form or other, you wouldn't have any of the facilities and helps that you would have today. People today, who are blind, for example, are able to function in ordinary society. There's lots of ways that they can be helped and so they can get on well. In that day and age, that was not the case. So if you had any of these problems, be they great or small, you would be uneducated, you would be unemployed, therefore you would be very poor. You'd be relying on the handouts from people as they go about their business and going to the temple and all this. And so we see this man who's been in this condition for at least 38 years, it says, and he's lying here at what they call the pool of Bethesda in verse 2. The pool of Bethesda. Now that's significant. It says there's multiple people like him, and it says apparently they've all been congregating or gathering together. Maybe just sort of that's where people like that go. But there's another reason why they were all together in and around what was called the colonnades. These 5 colonnades. Sort of porches or roofed areas. Why are they all there? Well, it tells us in verse 7. For example, we'll look at the interactions in a minute. But I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up. They actually have discovered this pool that we're talking about here, the pool of Bethesda, and some archaeology happened in Jerusalem, and they actually found it. They found the 5 sort of colonnades and all the rest of it, and they've actually found the pool of Bethesda and dug it up. And it turns out that it was a pool that was sort of connected with other sort of higher water sources. Jerusalem is sort of built on a hill, little hills here and there. And so upper water would have supplied the pool of Bethesda, other little tributaries as well, some smaller sort of fresh spring water would have also supplied this big pool known as the pool of Bethesda. And occasionally, as a result of its construction and the fresh springs and all the rest of it, water would occasionally bubble up. A bit of air would sort of get trapped in the system, so to speak, and it would be like a burp, and up it comes, it erupts a bit. And it seems to be that over time, sort of a superstition had developed, whereby when the water erupts or bubbles up like that, the first person in the water is the one who receives some sort of miraculous healing. Maybe legend had it that an angel would stir it or something like that. And so if you're the first one in, you're the first one to get the blessing. You're the first one to receive some healing. And you can see why, therefore, it would have attracted many people who were infirm or invalids, as this puts it. You've maybe heard of people traveling to France. Our Lady of Lourdes. It's a common spot, a pilgrimage site, and it's a place where miracles have happened in the past, and yet it attracts thousands of people every year to go on pilgrimage, particularly those who are sick and infirm, hoping for a miracle, hoping to be that one to receive that blessing. And we see a similar thing here, people waiting, I suppose, as it were, for the power of God. And it says there in verse 6, Jesus, it says, saw him lying there, and he knew that he'd been lying there a long time. Jesus saw him, right? And he knew something about this man. And the way that it's structured is that he had some sort of divine, perception. And he was able to know something significant about this man just by looking at him. He knew what this man needed. And so he asks this individual, whose name we don't know, in verse 6, do you want to be healed? What a strange question to ask of someone who's been lying there day in, day out for 38 years. Because it sounds obvious, doesn't it? That of course anyone in that situation would want to be healed. Do you want to be healed? After all these years of suffering and struggling and attempts to get better and disappointments when things haven't worked out, of course you'd want to get better. But it seems to be that this man has been stuck in this place for so long that perhaps he's resigned to thinking to himself that there is no use here. This is my lot. This is what I've been given. I just have to put up with this for the rest of my days. His response in verse 7, I think, is very instructive. Jesus asks him, do you want to be healed? The sick man answered, Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up, and while I'm going, another steps down before me. Do you want to be made well? He doesn't say, yes, I'll take anything, heal me. But he actually makes an excuse. Do you notice that? In fact, there's two excuses in his answer to Jesus. Firstly, he says, I have no one to put me into the water. In other words, he's saying, I can't help myself. I've got no strength or power. There's nothing in me that can get me to where I need to be. I'm powerless. And the second sort of half of the excuse, I suppose, number two, is that even when I'm trying, someone gets in there ahead of me. So not only do I have no power, but someone beats me to it. I'm not quick enough. I'm not savvy enough. I'm not clever enough. I'm not smart enough. I'm just not good enough. I've got no power. I've got no good in me. I can't help myself, and even if I had power, I wouldn't be good enough to make it anyway. And so it seems to be this man here, far from being hungry and ready for healing, I suppose, he's just resigned himself. And if anything, we can probably detect a bit of self-pity, which would be understandable, I suppose, in his position. But as we see at the beginning of this encounter, Jesus laid his eyes on the man. He saw him. And he knew him. He knew what was going on in his heart and in his thinking. Of course, he could see what was going on in his body. Everybody could see that. He knew what this man needed. He knew what he wanted. But he knew what he needed. And so he said to him in verse 8, after what seems like a very brief interaction, Jesus said to him, "Get up, take up your bed, and walk." In verse 9 it tells us, at once he was healed. And he picked up his gear and was able to walk. No dialogue ensued. No call to just believe and have faith and then you'll be healed. None of that. Just a word from God. It was like a command of Jesus, actually. Get up. Jesus spoke a word. And it happened. And it happened instantly. It was instant restoration. It's instant healing. After 38 years of being in that condition, a word from Jesus and he was released. Yes, a response was required. We see that a bit later on in verse 14. Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, "See, you're well. Sin no more." Yeah. You have been healed. Now I want you to live in response to what I've done. You've received my power and my goodness in place of your lack of power and your lack of goodness. Now live for me. So there's the response. It's live because of what I've done for you. Live in accordance to what I've done for you. That's how we know we've been transformed by Jesus, by his power and goodness. When we will desire to live for him, our lives will be profoundly shaped and changed after a life-changing encounter with Jesus. We'll never be the same again. And I think in this man that we've been looking at just over the last few minutes, there is a picture for at least some of us in this room. We've thought probably at the start it's represented a large group of people in our city, but perhaps for you it's even more personal than that. It might be true on a purely physical plane, but certainly it might be true of you on a spiritual, even a mental sort of level. I think this man can represent those of us who know, at least at some level, anyway, there is a gap in our lives. There is a need that's been unmet. There is a guilt that cannot be shifted. And like the man that we see here in John chapter 5, we're stood staring at the waters, hoping for something to get stirred up, looking for relief, looking for help, but being continually disappointed that someone always gets in ahead of me. And so it goes round, and so it goes round, and so it goes round. And so we look for ways to help ourselves, perhaps, through superstition, as it seems to be in this scenario here. But ultimately, any ways that we look to help ourselves are powerless. Maybe like this man here today, you realize that you cannot help yourself. You're powerless. You're not good enough anyway. And so whether it is like a superstitious hope, like a shot in the dark, or whether it's through religious practices or through some other things that you're doing, you're trying to help yourself, you're trying to make yourself feel well or feel better or get ahead. And time after time, year after year, those things have failed you. And perhaps you notice this increasing cynicism and hardness, resentfulness perhaps even growing, much like this man here. But if you in any way relate to this first character, to you, this morning Jesus says, "Rise, get up." He said, look at me, says Jesus. Stop looking down at the waters, hoping that one day they'll stir and you'll be in the right spot. Stop pinning your hopes on some vague thinking or vague thing working out. Jesus says, "I will grant you life. I will give you healing. I will begin in you the process of restoration that will continue on and on until perfection, until completion. I will come to you in a life-altering, life-transforming relationship to you." Do you want to be healed? Then come to Jesus and receive life. Come and receive his power and his goodness for you. Jesus transforms the needy And for you this morning, transformation begins when you trust that Jesus is what you need. Healing and restoration of the whole person is guaranteed by Jesus. Progress will be expected. Physical healing may even come instantly right now. They will come completely one day. Jesus transforms the needy. That's what he does. That's for you this morning. That's the first group of people, the first person that we see in this section. But there's a second section, and you know, we could sort of take the story that would finish at verse 9, and once the man was healed and took up his bed and walked. And that's where we'd end it, perhaps if we were teaching this as a Sunday school thing to kids. But even that verse doesn't end there, because it says, now, that day was the Sabbath. And we see the second group of people. Jesus unsettles the self-righteous. There's more to the story. That day was the Sabbath. The second group or players, I suppose, in this story are seen in verse 10. The Jews. So the Jews said to the man who had been healed, it's the Sabbath. It's not lawful for you to take up your bed. When the Apostle John, who wrote this gospel account, uses the term the Jews, he's not referring to all of the people of Israel, you know, the ethnic nation, I suppose, the ethnic people. He's referring specifically, he uses the term specifically in his gospel account to refer to the Jews that are hostile to Jesus. Often summed up and summarized by religious leaders or religious fundamentalists, such as the hardline sort of Pharisee sect that we see cropping up time and again. But these are this is John's understanding of the group of people that are hostile to Jesus and his message and his claims. That day was the Sabbath. That was a day of rest. It was commanded by law in the Ten Commandments that, you know, the last day of the week, the seventh day, was to be a day of rest. And it says that the Jews objected to this man picking up his mat and carrying it. Now, this idea of picking up somebody's mat and carrying that is not explicitly mentioned in the Bible. It's not mentioned in the law code. But what it was an extension. You know, if we are to rest on the seventh day, the thinking goes, then here's 250 things that we cannot do in order to rest. We cannot do this, we cannot do that, we cannot cook in this way, we cannot pick up the bed. It's the tradition that developed around the commandments. You know, the tradition of the elders is called elsewhere. And so they take this man to task. And you can start to see the problem in this group, can't you? Right? They have spectacularly missed the wood for the trees, as we would say. This man has just been healed miraculously and instantly and completely after being disabled or whatever it was for 38 years. A remarkable, amazing show of divine strength. This stupendous thing. Just imagine the crowds going daft as word gets around. But their response was, you're carrying your mat on the Sabbath. That's just mad, isn't it? This group are more concerned about their non-biblical religious traditions than this extraordinary manifestation of God's power through Jesus that day. I mean, how can they get this so wrong? So lopsided. Elsewhere in the Gospels, Jesus condemns this sort of behavior outright. We can see here in Matthew 23, verse 23, Jesus says, woe, it's placing a curse, you know. He's like, woe to you scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin and have neglected the weightier matters of law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. What he's saying is that you have been so focused on following these little tiny traditions and things that you think will please God, but you have missed the big picture, justice and mercy and faithfulness. And that's the same as what's going on here. They're hypocrites. So it's important to understand when they are criticizing this man for picking up his bed on the Sabbath, it is not that they don't get it in their heads. It's not an intellectual problem. It's not that these people can't see what's happened or understand what's happened. Of course they can. It's obvious. No one can deny it. There's been a remarkable healing and demonstration of God's power. We say, don't we, seeing is believing. But actually when it comes to these types of people, that's rubbish, because they can see all they want, but they do not believe. Seeing is not believing. It's total rubbish in this case. They can see just fine. They can understand just fine. The problem with this type of person and this group that we're examining is much deeper. The reason why they focus on the mat and not the fact that this guy has just been remarkably healed is because they don't want to believe. Right? They don't want to acknowledge what's just happened right in front of their eyes. They choose to focus on the fact of the mat rather than the power of God in Jesus. For them, it is not an intellectual issue. They are not stupid. It is a deeper issue. It is a more profound issue. The Bible would say it's a heart issue. The very core of someone's being goes beyond the intellect. Why do you think that is? Why is it that some people would behave like this when they see the power and the goodness of Jesus so clearly? Why would anyone be like that? Well, the answer is because Jesus unsettles the self-righteous. Jesus is radically unsettling to many people. Why is he unsettling? He's unsettling because you can't control his power and his goodness. He uses his power and his goodness flowing out of his heart as he wants, not as we want. And that's a wonderful thing if you receive it, but it's a terrible thing if you're trying to control it and coerce it and just sort of keep Jesus at arm's length and keep a lid on it. If you want to contain something of Jesus and if you want it to be nice and neat, then he's not your man. If your focus in life is keeping things neat, keeping the laws great and small, then if you do that and you live as such, that's absolutely fine. But you're doing that to sort of maintain a sense of control over your own life. That's why we do it. And you can use religion in a similar way, a sense of control, keeping various rules and laws and traditions. Just don't let things get too out of hand. You can manage it. And if the goal of your life is to keep God happy by ticking as many boxes as possible and obeying as many laws as you possibly can, then you're working towards trying to keep things nice and steady, trying to contain God, right? Because if you understand God as only operating as and when you obey him, then you're keeping him in your pocket, you're controlling him. You get to dictate your own path, right? You get to be the captain of your own destiny. And you can use religion to do that. It's amazing. Safe, isn't it, to be like that, to look at the mat and forget the power, forget the healing. And it avoids unsettling episodes in life, and you can become very good at it indeed. Religious people, church people are very good at that. But just observe what it does, if that's you. Look at the reaction to Jesus and his power. You know, we sing songs to this effect, and we gather and we say, oh Lord, we want you to move, and yet some of us don't actually want that deeply. Look at the reaction to Jesus and his power and his goodness and his transformation. It's too unsettling for these people. It's too out of control. They can't control it. They can't master it. And so they prefer the safety of focusing on the mat. And if that's you, or if that sort of represents something of how you approach life, then you'll probably notice that it's quite easy to start looking down at other people. So start sneering at them. Maybe not outwardly, but inwardly. Because they don't match up the way that you do. Oh, you haven't picked up your mat today. I've picked up my mat. when you see God's power and goodness at work in other people, you're not full of praise and joy and saying, how great is our God? You focus and say, you're breaking the law, you're doing this wrong. As religious people, I think we can sometimes forget. We know that we can disobey God by sinning against him, by doing wrong things. We know that. But we forget that we can actually disobey God through doing the right things for the wrong reasons. We can actually disobey God by using our religion and our law-keeping. And the reason why we're disobeying him is because they're not coming from a heart that's being transformed by Jesus' power and his goodness. It's coming from a heart that's trying to control God. And so for them, religion is controlling God by putting him in debt to them. Jesus unsettles the self-righteous. They see grace lavishly being applied to other people, and they respond by fault-finding, nitpicking, extinguishing the flames of revival, crushing faith rising. Or as the Apostle Paul puts it, quenching the Spirit. That's what they do. So two groups of people actually encounter Jesus in this story. Let's draw things together and let's try and apply them a little bit then, because we don't know where the healed man ended up. We don't know what way he lived his life after that. Neither do we know the response of the religious people who picked him up for picking up his mat. But one thing we can say for sure is that Jesus always provokes a reaction. Kind of like Marmite, I suppose, without sounding hopefully disrespectful. You either love him or you hate him. You either are attracted by Jesus and want to move further and closer to him, or you are repelled by Jesus and you do your best to insulate yourself from him and move away from him. Either one or the other. If there is no reaction to Jesus, that's because you either haven't heard about him or you haven't really thought it through. You're just sort of trying to remain numb. But the truth is, I think there's probably an element of both of these types of people within us, the needy and the self-righteous. And often we'll veer to one way or the other. We'll try and either dig ourselves out and center our lives on some empty hope, or we'll go all religious in an effort to get God to do what we want him to do. We miss the wood for the trees. But the good news that I'm here to tell you about this morning is that Jesus sees you and Jesus knows you. And through the gospel, through the good news, he is for you. He offers you his grace. He offers you his power, his goodness, his acceptance, his forgiveness. He comes to turn the unlovely into the lovely. He comes to take the mess and create beauty. He lifts up the lowly and he humbles the proud. And both will find life and peace in Jesus. Through his death on the cross, we have life, and when he rose on the third day, he rose to eternal life to give and share that life with us. His forgiveness to us, rest to our souls, healing to our entire being. And he offers that real life change beginning today, continuing on forever. Through faith in his name, through faith in who he is, what he's done. Let's separate things out as we try and get real specific here. Maybe number one out of two, you need to take steps of faith this morning. Maybe you need to stop looking down into the waters, waiting for them to be stirred, hoping that one day it's your day. You need to stop that and start this morning looking up to Jesus to achieve all that you could ever need and more. That means trusting that Jesus can save you, but trusting that he wants to save you and that he has saved you. He is able to do all of that, not you. Sometimes we need to come to the end of ourselves to realize that. He is able, not us, and that is good news. Maybe that's you this morning. Take a step of faith. Come to Christ. Second way, you may be affected by this teaching. Perhaps you're coming from the other perspective, that of the religious person. Particularly as we see them in this text today. You like the idea of God's power and goodness. You may even benefit from it personally, but you're uncomfortable where it could all end up. It's all too messy for you. It's too unpredictable. It's just improper. And so you withdraw yourself. You restrict yourself. You create a system of laws for you to hide behind. Let me say clearly, the reality of life together, life with God, it is messy, but it is good. He will challenge your comfort. He will make you feel awkward. He will, at times, even feel dangerous to you. Wild, maybe, like fire. But if that's you, you must know that the same power and goodness that saves a mess like you is the same power and goodness that saves everyone, no matter how messy their lives may appear in your eyes. Let's finish with what I will call a vision test. And I mean the vision, I suppose, of your imagination. We're not going to test your eyes to see if you're short-sighted or long-sighted. A vision test. Imagine with me for a moment a church, maybe like this one here, filled with people who are described in verse 3. A multitude of invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. Imagine a church full of people like that, chronically unemployed, the poor, the destitute, people with a past, people who are stuck, people who have no one to help, people who have no place to go. But people who have had an encounter with Jesus. They have experienced something of his power and goodness. Imagine a church full of people like that. But then imagine mixed in with those people who have experienced the power and goodness of Jesus. Imagine mixed in with them also people who were formerly religious sort of fundamentalists. They used to be judgy, hard-hearted, mean-spirited people. And they too have had an encounter with the goodness and power of Jesus, with Jesus himself. And now there they are, in church, with these big transformed hearts and open wallets and open homes, all of them, both of these groups, doing life together, helping one another, all individually and as a group, reflecting the glory of God and Jesus and what he's done and celebrating him. Imagine a church like that. It'll be a bit bonkers. It'll be a bit messy. But it would be amazing. It would be glorious. As you imagine that vision, and we do this vision test, if you're saying to yourself, yes, that's the sort of church I want to be part of. That's what I want to see. If that's your response to that vision test, then you're starting to understand and marvel at what God has done for you in Jesus. And you want to see that more. And you want to see other people experience that more. If you say yes, that's what's going on in your life right now. That's what he's doing in your heart. But if you think of that vision test and you think, oh no, that sounds awful. That's the sort of church I would not like to be a part of. I like church just to be nice and still and respectful. If you sort of shrink away, then may I say clearly and with respect, you haven't understood Jesus. You haven't understood the gospel. You haven't understood his goodness, his power. That's what he does. May God help us to understand and receive more of Jesus and what he has for us today. Amen. Let's pray.